so good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the final webinar in our three-part series on solar PV operations and maintenance. If you weren't able to attend the first two in this webinar series, there's no worries there, as they aren't really necessary to understand today's content, but I do hope that you'll check them out to get a fuller picture on solar PV O&M procurement. To quickly get some housekeeping out of the way, the presentation portion of the webinar will be recorded and provided to you after the webinar, along with a copy of the slides. During the presentation, we'll also be dropping the links from the slides into Zoom chat, but if you miss any of those, there will also be they will also be in the follow-up email. We do ask that you utilize the Q&A feature to interact and drop in your questions, and we'll have some time at the end of the session today to go over any questions that you may have. So this webinar is presented to you by the Renewables Acquisition Team at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. My name is Billie Holecek, and I am a research associate who's been working on the Renewables Acquisition Team for the past year, researching best practices for solar PV. I will be presenting alongside Gerald Robinson, who is the program manager for this project, and Gerald has supported federal agencies for over the last decade with the procurement and management of on-site solar PV systems, and is an advocate for best practices with solar PV O&M to help ensure quality, safety, and performance of these systems. All right, so this is the agenda for today. I'll start off by briefly talking about some of the programs that are sponsoring this work, and then I'll review the core scope for PV O&M contracts. From there, you'll hear from Gerald, who will discuss common procurement pathways and how to estimate cost of services. We'll then review some helpful resources and close out with approximately 10 minutes for Q&A. Again, throughout the presentation, please put your questions in the Q&A section and we'll address them during the discussion at the end. So this research effort is funded in part by the Empower Procurement Program. Empower Procurement is a procurement assistance program that's funded by the California Energy Commission with a primary mission of increasing the adoption of clean energy technologies in the state of California. Our team at Berkeley Lab, which includes Gerald and myself, as well as 3 others, leads the contracting and consulting initiatives out of the program. So through these, we work with large institutions across the state to discuss their challenges with sustainable purchasing, help them develop sustainable purchasing policy and other contracting language. And recently, we've even begun to dive into the world of e-procurement and how e-procurement systems can be used to support sustainable purchasing. If that is a topic that you're interested in, please feel free to reach out to me because we've just started a working group on this and we'd love to have more participants. If you're interested in learning more about the program in general, please feel free to visit our website where you can find more information. This research into solar PV O&M is also in part funded under the Department of Energy's Federal Energy Management Program, or FEMP. FEMP is a broad-based program that is aimed at helping federal agencies meet their energy and sustainability goals through various efforts, including things like distributed energy implementation, performance contracting, fleet electrification, and resilience. Our renewables acquisition team at the lab works to support FEMP by providing technical and procurement expertise to agencies. So again, you can visit the website below to check out some of the resources that have been developed for renewables acquisition. The last thing I'm going to go over briefly before jumping into the content is our first 2 webinars in this series. So webinar 1 was predominantly for solar PV O&M buyers, and in this we dive deep into some common challenges with solar PV O&M, as well as the importance of O&M for your solar systems. If you wanted to learn about this more in depth, you can find it in the first webinar. I believe the link was just dropped in the chat. The second webinar focused on connecting buyers and providers by discussing the existing marketplace for solar O&M, including how buyers are requesting services, some of the indication of the need for O&M services, and it ended in a discussion between buyers and providers. So again, if you're interested in watching this, we have that recording available and you can access it via the link in chat. All right, so let's just do a quick reminder of why we should actually care about O&M for solar systems. An effective O&M plan can help organizations in a lot of different ways, and the first and really the most important is that it helps to reduce serious life safety risks that could be caused by an unmaintained system. O&M also helps to increase financial return by maximizing system performance and reducing system downtime, increasing the lifespan of the system, and also avoiding unnecessary repowering costs. O&M plans can help to keep equipment within warranty compliance and also help to increase the overall appearance and aesthetics of the system. All right, so now let's jump in and talk about the PV O&M core contract scope and the type of language you should be aware of when writing a scope of work for O&M services. There are three major types of service areas when it comes to maintaining your solar PV system. We're calling this an O&M service framework. This includes preventative, corrective, and additional services. And this is also the way that you'll see a contract or pricing broken down. But before we talk about that contract and the pricing, let's talk a bit about what each of these service categories actually are. The first is preventative service. So for solar, this really comprises the focus and the bulk of the work that's needed to prevent things like system degradation, substandard system operation, or even system failure. And examples of this service type could include things like vegetation management, module cleaning, inspection and testing, or something like data monitoring. Thinking of this another way, you can kind of think of preventative maintenance like the work we do to maintain our own health by doing things like scheduling services such as an annual checkup at the doctor or an annual visit to the dentist. You're not really aware that anything might be going wrong, but you're going in to get that checkup and to get that teeth cleaning to prevent something from going wrong in the future. And also to find out about some small health issues that may be occurring before they turn into larger issues. Much like for yourself, your PV system needs these checkups to make sure that the system is well maintained. The second is corrective services. So this is the needed repairs or replacements of failed equipments that are necessary to bring the PV system back to baseline conditions. These types of services are often found while doing the contracted preventative service and will also build up over time if you're employing a reactive maintenance technique or because of lack of staff time or money available to maintain the system. This would include something like replacing the system as-built drawings or reconnecting the monitoring system. Again, in terms of yourself, think of this like knowing you need to go get glasses so you can have that baseline 20/20 vision and see as expected. But this might be something that you're putting off because like with solar, you don't have the time or the money, but it's still something that is important to try and get done as soon as possible so you can perform at that baseline condition. All right, the last type is additional services. So these are the services that you likely have not planned for and usually result from unforeseen circumstances, such as severe weather. In terms of health, this would be like breaking your arm, unexpected, but nevertheless still important to address to make sure your health and the system health is still okay. Now to get a bit more in depth, an example of a preventative service would be something like electrical inspection and testing. You want to add this to your preventative service plan so it can be done on a reoccurring basis because it's better to catch the smaller problems before they grow into larger ones. Electrical inspection and testing helps to ensure your system is performing as expected by using a solar PV meter to check that performance, and it also helps to check for the presence of any electrical faults that may be there. This really is one of the core activities of a good O&M plan because it helps to decrease potential life safety issues, as well as ensure that your panels don't end up like the ones that you see in the picture on the bottom of the screen there. An example of a corrective service would be something like reconnecting monitoring equipment. Usually something like this is put to the bottom of a maintenance list because there might be other more pressing issues like fixing those electrical faults. But it's still important to do so you can know how well your system is actually running and if it's meeting those baseline expectations. System monitoring also helps to share key performance indicators and can really help to indicate if there are any system problems occurring based on those indicators. And at last, we have our additional services. So these services might be something you've already contracted for in your current service contract, but things like unexpected weather events or other just unexpected events require you to request an additional service. So one example of an additional service that you may have already have built into your contract could be something like snow and ice removal. This would really become that additional service when your need for snow and ice removal surpasses what you have written into your service agreement, and you now need to request it an extra time or two because there have been more snowstorms than expected in that particular year. Another example of this would be if there was a big hailstorm that cracked your solar module, and this is something that you really did not plan for at all, like that broken arm I just talked about, but now needs to be assessed by your solar provider and fixed in order to ensure solar production continues as expected. But just because this is an additional service doesn't really mean it's something that you have no plan for and no pricing estimated for. And we'll talk about that pricing in just a second, but first, this framework can actually be built into the way that you create your service contract. So on the top of the slide here, you can see the general language that we would recommend including in your scope of work section. So if you are writing a scope of work for O&M services and looking for language that you could just cut and paste, this is the language that you can use to incorporate it into your solicitation to use in a way that works best for you. Below the language, you'll also see some example services that could be good to include in a PV O&M contract. However, I do want to note that this is not an exhaustive list of the services you should request. So if you're interested in understanding all the types of services you should request, I would recommend viewing the PV O&M Best Practices Guide, and you should see a link to that in chat in just a second. And the last thing is the O&M service pricing schedule. So you can see here that the schedule is categorized using that same framework I just reviewed. This is an example of what would be expected when incorporating O&M services into a pricing schedule. You can see here that the additional and corrective services are lumped into one category because, like I said before, a lot of times these services will overlap. So instead of breaking them out into different categories, they can just be put in one category and be charged for the time serviced. So something like snow removal would not need a new price. It would just be that same price that you and your contractor agreed on previously, but charged based on how many additional times you request that same service. The actual cost of the service would be something provided by contractors during the bidding process. So this is just an example of the O&M service pricing schedule. And if you are interested in viewing the full schedule, you can check it out by accessing FEM's Operations and Maintenance Request for Proposal template. The pricing schedule, as well as the simple language shared in the earlier slides and the O&M service framework, are all incorporated into your contract, no matter the type of contract that you'll use. So I'm now going to pass it over to Gerald to talk about some of those different contracting options available.
Great, thank you, Billie. Okay, so here we are as a group of institutional managers with a lot of assets now installed on our properties. So we now own these and we are responsible to maintain them. And so we can't really run from the cost, and we can do some things to reduce the cost. That's what I want to talk about through contracting and also improve the performance. Next slide. So here's a list of the procurement methods that we've kind of laid out. It's important to note that, you know, I deal with a lot of different agencies and I sort of see what current practices are there. And, you know, for example, there's a lot of reactionary maintenance currently taking place, which is the situation where, you know, okay, something goes wrong, then you call in a service provider and that is the most expensive way to maintain any asset. Solar PV is really like a building system, so like HVAC or lighting, except that it produces power, so it actually produces savings. And when you maintain it using reactionary maintenance practices, what you're doing is you're degrading your savings potential, and the system is potentially unsafe. So that's a really big concern. So that's not really an option that we want to focus on today. We want to focus on contracted service options, and also in-house service options, or a blend of those two, because some people blend those. And so we're going to talk about what we call simple contracts, master agreements, full and open contracts, and then base operating and site service agreements. So next slide. So again, we've touched upon this earlier, but the benefits of a service contract for O&M is, number one, safety, right? So somebody is going out and doing a recurring inspection and repair of the solar PV system, and they're going to catch small issues before they become large, serious hazards. So two dramatic examples are fire and potential structural failures. The other reason is that contracting for solar PV services is much lower cost than reactionary, or God forbid, nothing. And that again has to do with the fact that this is an asset that generates power and generates savings to the site. Another thing that I see a lot in institutions is that there's retirements, people get promoted, they move sites. So there's a lot of staff changes, and a contract is the bridge between that change, and it provides continuity of service between those staff changes. And then lastly, contracting, though it may not seem it on the face of it because it takes effort to put them in place, is really the least administrative burdensome manner. So reactionary maintenance is really burdensome on staff. And it is in an unplanned, each and every incident is unplanned for and unwelcome. But in a contract context, things are done by and large without you having to interject or intervene. So it's a much better way to go. So next slide, please. So here's another thing that I see happening a lot right now is that, we're busy, everyone is under-resourced for staff, particularly procurement staff, sometimes maintenance staff, is that in institutional procurement, there is a certain amount of spending that can occur. We call that sort of discretionary spending. For example, in the federal sector, a lot of agencies are allowed to spend up to $2,500 without really having to go through the process of issuing a formal contract. So what I see agencies and institutions doing is issuing these very simple contracts. They're under the threshold amount, let's say $2,500. So understandable, we're busy, people are doing that. Okay, so easy to implement is the pro. It's quick. I've seen agencies use the contract templates from the service provider themselves. And it's, good and appropriate for small systems. So, okay, but what are the cons? It's limited to small systems. If you try to apply this model to larger systems, what you're going to end up doing is not maintaining the system because you're not going to be able to afford the real core services that are needed. So electrical PM, preventative maintenance would be one of those examples that is absolutely essential to keeping a system operating at its expected level and in a safe manner. Also, using discretionary funds in this manner will cannibalize other priorities that you have in your facilities. So it's got a lot of limitations. So next one, please. A next option is master agreements. So there's master agreements that are referred to, the way they're referred to on a state and local level are different than the way we refer to them in the federal world. But these are pre-negotiated contracts with pre-selected group of contractors where the terms and conditions and sometimes pricing are set. So what that allows for is an agency to just issue a task order, that's a federal term, or just a simple directive of scope, and they can engage industry without having to go through the entire process of procurement. Everything is done, it's all preset, very streamlined. The cons is that currently master agreements are really not in place that are explicitly directed to solar PV O&M services. This is something that we are working on in some collaborations at the federal level, but I expect this area to grow over time. But right now, because solar PV O&M is really an area that is taking shape, it is not yet really an easy to engage tool. Next, please. So a couple examples of places where you might look or watch for master agreements, because they, again, we do expect them to mature and become available, is that we have, the California Department of General Services, they have a group that does service contracts, and they actually will, they provide direct technical assistance to agencies around the state. And then we have the United States Department of General Services. Their federal acquisition services, they have a schedule of a whole library of different types of service contracts that are there. Again, you won't find anything that isn't explicitly directed to solar PV O&M. And we're collaborating, or the Federal Energy Management Program is collaborating with GSA to try to put something in place. It's not there. Someday we will see it, but check these links periodically. Hopefully you will see something there. Any questions about this from the federal agencies on the line right now, please, put questions in the FEMP technical assistance portal. We'll have a link to that later. Next slide. So, largely right now, what we have is really full and open contracts, really. So that's what is available to most of us. And what that means really is that you have to create a solicitation from blank pages, right? You got to start from the beginning, create a typical solicitation, go through all the approvals, go through the process of posting, selecting a contractor, awarding, all that. It's, until we have tools like master agreements, this is really one of the main tools that we have today. The pros really are that, it can be customized for your agency. So I saw in the chat, some of you on this line are maintaining some pretty large systems. So you probably have some pretty unique needs. You probably have a real call for doing a full and open. This is also great for systems that have storage or microgrid components, again, that add a level of complexity that a master agreement certainly would have problems incorporating. So one of the cons, however, as many of you on the line probably know, is that it takes effort to put this in place. But I would argue that the effort that you invest to put this in place still pales against the effort you have to put out should you pursue reactionary maintenance efforts, which are the most burdensome of all options. Next slide, please. So to make life easier for you, we have put together some resources. So we understand that people are probably going to put together some full and open contracts. So one of the things that we've done is we put together some templated language that you can cut and paste from. So we have two versions of this document. We have one for federal agencies that have unique federal regulations and requirements. And then we have one that's general, we call it general commercial use, which would be appropriate for state agencies and local governments and school districts. So we use the unified contract format to structure it. And it's designed for you to just go grab things that you need and save yourself some time. And it is well, I highly encourage you to look at these documents. We put a lot of time and thought into this resource for you. Next slide, please. So another area where you can gain some contracting, and I see from our poll that we actually have some folks that have done this, is the base operating, that's a Department of Defense term, or site service agreement. So these are essentially site-wide, sort of all-encompassing O&M agreements that are signed with some third-party private sector company, and you see them often in agencies that have campuses or multiple sites. They have a lot of real estate to manage. They're common with the General Service Administration, the Department of Defense, and I know some state agencies use them. The good thing about site operating agreements is that they're really easy and fast to add scope to, because they're built to change, because you're building buildings, you're tearing down buildings, things change constantly, new technologies. So these are contracts that are constantly built to be modified. So it's easy for you to add scope of work to a site operating agreement. So you could go, for example, to the tools that we just talked about, where we have some templated language. You can go to section C, scope of work, and you could grab from there to put together an easy scope of work and add it to your site operating agreement. One con, and I don't believe this is a very serious con, is that right now the service industry is taking shape. It's an incredibly fast growing area of solar PV activity. And so some people may find it hard to find service providers. We recognize that. That is temporary, that will change, but right now it is hard to find people that are available is one issue. So next slide, please. In-house service, I know from folks that I've worked with that they want to do at least some things in-house. And we want to put up a huge caution sign here, and I'll explain what I mean by the caution about self-performing. But here's two examples of things that you can do in-house, easily save money, and panel cleaning and vegetation management, two things that you can do safely and easily without having to worry about harm to your staff. So next slide, please. But however, I've worked as a plant manager, so I know that some folks here on the line will want to do things in-house. They have trained staff, and so one thing that you can do is go to this webinar, which is a really well done webinar that talks about how to maintain your own system. It goes through all the safety issues, talks about personal protection equipment, and it also provides you with an understanding of the professional qualifications that you really need to perform this work. And that is a very, very important point I want to make. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so that it really deserves emphasizing that you probably have very talented electrical techs, maybe electricians on your staff. However, solar is different. Why is it different? Most solar systems have a DC side. some of the designs that have gone in over the last decade are relatively high voltage. They're up to 1500 volts DC. That is very dangerous, and that is very unique. And that is something that your electricians or electrical techs have probably not come across yet. So that requires training. And I cannot emphasize that enough. So here's a couple of training resources. So NABCEB, or North American Board of Certified Energy Practitioners. And then there's also licensing requirements by state that you should look up. And we provided a link here to the Interstate Renewable Energy Council that maintains that list. All right, so next slide. So for those of you in California, which is most of us here, is that California requires an additional license. They call it the C46. They've recognized that solar PV is unique among electrical systems, and therefore they require this licensing, and it is highly encouraged that your staff gain this license. Okay, so next slide, please. So moving on to, so we talked about contracting, and we're encouraging you to really consider moving to formal contracts for all the various reasons we've already discussed. So the next question that's going to come up is, well, what does this cost, right? So we want to provide you with some resources for understanding what costs are. And I want to emphasize here too that unique to solar PV systems, unlike HVAC or lighting systems in a building, is that O&M investments in solar PV have a return on the investment, right? So if you do not maintain your systems adequately, they will not perform for you, and you will lose money. If you make the investment of O&M, they will maintain their performance, and they will maintain their safety, and they will not give you undue surprises of having to replace large systems, large sections or components. So very, very important. O&M is cost effective when it comes to solar PV. It is well worth the time to go through the budgeting process. Okay, so next slide, please. So the National Renewable Energy Lab has led the development of this really handy tool. It's the cost calculator for solar PV O&M. This was led by Andy Walker, who is the foremost expert in solar PV O&M. And this tool is maintained. So the behind the scenes is pricing information. So that pricing information is maintained and updated on a regular basis. So this tool is also available to you, and we'll provide a link, or we can send you the actual Excel sheet. It's so you can take this tool and learn how to use it. And it's pretty straightforward in many respects. I'm going to show you soon a little live demo. But this is an example of the main input sheet. Some of you who are not technically oriented may find some of this a little confusing, but for example, your facilities engineers will quickly understand this material and be able to enter information. So next slide. So here's an example of the one of the reports that this produces. So here's a report that lists the measures, right? So for what you're going to be using this tool is for budgeting, right? You can say, how much do I need to set aside in my budget so that I can then engage in a contract? And so what you do is use this tool to put together the scope that you feel you need, and we've provided you the resources to make the decision about what scope you want. Then this tool will help you price that scope. So they break it down to some really handy numbers. They provide average annual cost per year. If some of you deal with net present value, they time value of money, which is more common in the private sector, they provide that. They provide an interesting breakdown of the, what measures are going to cost what percentage of the total, which is kind of handy. You can use that for sensitivity analysis, say, I want to add or do less of something, more of another. This is a very handy tool. And then the biggest feature is that on the right column where it's titled commercial, you'll see this number $11.99. What that says is that's the amount of money you're going to spend per kW per year. And so that number changes over time, and I'll show you that too, but that is your budget number right there. Bingo, you got it. So very handy tool. So next slide, please. So here is a slide showing the breakdown of costs. These are now averages over the different sectors. So we have residential, we have commercial roof, commercial ground, utility scale fixed, and utility scale tracking, right? And notice, most of us on the call here today are probably in the commercial roof, commercial ground. So, notice that right now prices are running $17 to $18 per kW per year for O&M services. So that's kind of your reality check, or your base benchmark you can use here. On the right lists all the components that go into that pricing. So that's the scope on the right. So next slide, please. So what I want to do next is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to show you the tool. And so let me just, so here's this input screen that we saw. Oh, let me pause a second and say that, there's going to be questions. There is a really good set of instructions that come with this. There's an instructions tab. Federal agencies that have questions about this tool, please go to the FEMP Technical Assistance portal, and then state and local governments, if you have questions, please send me an email. I'll do my best to get back to you with any questions. So quickly, here's the input screen.
Oh, hey, Gerald, we can't see your screen yet.
Oh. It would help if I shared it. There we go. Okay. So yeah, thank you, Billie. So here's the main input screen that we showed earlier on a slide. And this is pretty straightforward. Again, your facilities engineering group probably would pick this up quick. I'm just going to run you through this tool quickly. So here's one of the main report tabs. And again, it provides a lot of information, some of which is, the time value of money piece and net present value there. That's really something I know a lot of private sector people use. But one thing I want to show you on this report is this graph here. It shows that there's two things. One, in this budgeting tool, that there is a reserve account. Remember we talked about additional services? Well, the reserve account budgeting exercise is built into this tool to help you manage those unforeseens, which do occur. So this is a great way to put a number on that unforeseen additional service. It also does show something else that's very important, and that is that solar PV systems do age, and the cost to maintain them does increase over time. So this tool helps you manage those complexities. And that's a very, very important feature of this tool. So I'm just going to move through these other tabs. So here's a user-defined report. This is something that you can use to customize and play around with budgeting questions and sensitivity analysis. But I also want to point out that, here, for example, what it gives you ultimately, which I think most people here want to know, is for this next year, at least, what is the cost per kW that you need to budget for based on these assumptions. So going through the detail measures, here's a table that shows all the basic data that has gone into the calculations. Here is the data that shows labor rates. So lots and lots of information here. You don't necessarily need to interact with these tabs. You can just work in the input tab and the report tab. But I just want to show you that there's a lot of good information that is put into this tool. So let's see some other things. Okay, so here's some instructions that I want to point out that provides definitions in what you should be putting in the various cells. Generally very straightforward to use, but a very, very powerful tool. Again, please contact us should you have any questions. And I am going to hand it back to Billie.
Awesome. Thank you, Gerald. Just give me 1 second to reshare screen. All right. So before we move over to the Q&A session, we do want to leave you all with some resources and tools that are relevant in this industry. You'll have access to these slides when we send out the recording, so I'm not going to spend time going through every resource, but there are links to training, contract template language, informational guides, and fact sheets. So definitely check out these resources when you get a chance. Another helpful resource, and I saw someone ask about this in chat, is how specifically can you find solar PV O&M providers? So this is something we talked about a bit more in depth in the second webinar. So if you want to learn how to use these resources, I do recommend watching that one. But they're via the Solar Energy Industries Association, Amicus O&M Cooperative, or your state's Solar and Storage Association. Those are all different ways to find service providers. Some you do have to search a bit more in depth to find someone specific for O&M and specific for your system size, but this is definitely a starting point. And that brings us to the questions portion of the webinar. My colleague Ian Hoffman is going to be facilitating this session, but we do ask if you have any questions to either put it in the Q&A box in Zoom or to raise your hand and Ian will call it on you. So I'm now going to pass it over to Ian.
Hi, thank you, Billie and Gerald. We do have a few questions here. First, one of the questions comes from somebody whose site does not own any PV assets. They're using instead a power purchase agreement with a financial partner owning the asset. She asks, how does this complicate the procurement of O&M services? There's a follow-up question after you finish, Gerald, if you unmute.
Yeah, well, so what she's saying is that it's a third-party owned on-site system, right? So it's not owned by the agency, it's owned by somebody else. So in general, the companies that own and operate those systems are well equipped and generally do maintain the systems because their revenue is dependent upon it. If they're not, there's something wrong with the company, might be in trouble. You need to take note. And that's another matter altogether. And you can contact me if you're struggling with that. But in general, companies do a good job when they own and maintain a system that's hosted on an institutional site. Not always, but in general.
I think that actually addresses the follow-up question, and so I'll request that the questioner, if it doesn't, to go ahead and add a new question to the Q&A. We also have a question here about there's a question about why we're talking about templates, why the government would be involved in producing these templates, and I think part of the answer is that a lot of the folks on the call represent state or government entities.
Yeah.
And that also,
Well,
but it could be helpful for even private sector entities. You wouldn't necessarily have to invoke go to this contract with the services of a lawyer. Gerald, do you want to say more?
Yeah, so the templates are not a regulatory document. They're not mandates. It's just there to help you look at how scope is described and then some of the requirements that somebody might ask. So site access is a common one, at least in the federal world. We have a lot of unique site access stuff, so we have some language about that. So we're trying to be helpful in making it quick and easy for you to scrap together a full and open contract. That's the intent. But it's take it or leave it. If you find nothing of any use, you don't use any of it. But I would suspect you're going to find some of it useful. The framework of how to classify things, preventative, corrective, and additional, I think is really helpful. And you might just find that framework helpful in describing how you want services and how you price services and get services. So anyways, I think the tools can be quite helpful.
Thank you. Let's see. Here we have my favorite question for webinars, I think maybe this entire month. Can we rent sheep, or do goats do a better job?
Oh, well, goats are, So goats will climb on the arrays and they will chew everything. So that's usually not a choice, but sheep are compatible. So you don't want goats. What happens when goats get onto the modules, they'll crack them. Even if they don't crack the glass, they will crack the cells underneath. So that's not a great option. But sheep are used. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you. This next question regards the cost calculator. I don't know if we want to put it up on the screen, but the question is whether or not it integrates the cost for repowering or replacing the inverters. My recollection is it does.
Yes, it does. Yeah. So you don't have to use the tool for that, but it has built into it the reserve account. So the idea with the reserve account is to do such things as inverter replacements. If you have a serious repowering, rewiring episode, and there's a number of reasons why that does happen, the tool I don't believe encompasses that, but it does encompass the typical things like inverter module replacements that from early failures and other things like that. So that is in there.
Okay. Our next question concerns ESPCs and whether those generally include O&M costs in their payback calculations.
Yes.
You know?
Okay.
Or do you need to request that separately?
No. So ESPCs, I'm not an ESPC expert, but they do have a certain time of O&M that's provided, typically. So some number of years. I don't believe, though, I'm not 100% sure that it lasts the entire term of the ESPC contract. So eventually, if you do an ESPC where that solar asset becomes government owned, which is most of them, you will need to start thinking about O&M. And it's also just good to know what is a core set of O&M activities that should be done, electrical, preventative maintenance, for example, so that you can kind of keep an eye on the O&M activities that are occurring and make sure they're adequate. So that it's good to self-educate a little bit.
Good. Next question is, do you have an estimate on what the range of power production reduction would be due to dirt, dust, or pollen collection? This question comes from someone who has 17,000 panels mounted on the ground and tied to a microgrid and other production equipment.
Yeah, that's a golden question in terms of understanding. I can't unfortunately give you a specific number that, you know, if you don't maintain, you're going to see an X% reduction. There's so many variables. The only thing I can tell you with great certainty is that it will reduce your production and the system will go offline. But that is a golden question. That is something that I know researchers are looking at. They've got a huge data set, and it's something that FEMP has a PV performance team led by Nicole Leboff and Andy Walker from NREL, and they're looking at some of those questions, but I don't have one number to give you, unfortunately. I will mention module cleaning is an area that a lot of people in areas with rain believe they don't need to do, and they do. Why? Because it drops your production, but it also will reduce the usable life of the module because it creates hotspots on the module. So very important that people understand that module cleaning is a core activity. At one point we didn't believe maintenance at all was needed for solar. Then it's sort of like, we don't need maintenance on module, we don't need to clean the modules, but you know, all that has changed. Yes, you need to clean your modules.
Okay. Let's see, we've asked, someone asks for your thoughts about best practices for maintenance documentation and whether having a monitoring platform is sufficient for O&M documentation.
Monitoring systems are absolutely essential to have in place, but it's not the final need. So in the templates, we actually talk about what might be some good field reports, because you need some ability to be able to see what things are being done and repaired, and you have to have some record of that. So we provide some suggestions of what might be usable field data to have reported back to you by your service provider. The Solar PV O&M Best Practices Guide also touches upon that too. So monitoring, absolutely core, must have, plus good records from your O&M provider and that's a pretty standard, by the way. That's not asking for anything unusual, but you have to have both.
Okay. And one of the questioners also wants to know whether there are specific resources to which you might refer for systems with battery storage, particularly whether some guidance on scoping out the services.
Yeah, so we have not included much on battery storage maintenance yet. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the best practices guide, the latest edition, the 3rd edition, is starting to touch upon storage. The systems should come with manufacturer prescribed O&M measures that you should get a hold of and make sure those are done. So it's a burgeoning area, and we're starting to look at that. So.
Okay. Let's see, one is just a clarification on the cost calculator, whether when you expand your current system, whether you can use that spreadsheet.
Oh yeah, oh absolutely. One of the inputs is system size. Okay. In KW, yeah. So absolutely you can. Yeah.
Let's see. We also have a question from someone whose system took a hit from hail yesterday, and they want to know if you have a PPA, should kind of some specific O&M around that kind of thing be found in the document? Do Is it up to the provider, the O&M provider, to check after a storm, or is that something where the customer notifies the provider? Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. So the power purchase agreement would have a private owner who maintains insurance, right? So that's going to be between that owner and their insurance provider. However, they contractually are obligated. Hopefully your contract has minimum production guarantees, so that I don't know if it does. But speaking of a hail loss, if that individual would please contact me, because we have a group that's looking at weather impacts, and we're doing a whole bunch of things around weather impacts. So please contact me, but or go to the FEM Technical Assistance Portal. But again, in a power purchase agreement arrangement, there's private insurance. And so hopefully that goes well, and that they maintain their obligation to you. So that's how that arrangement works.
Let's see, we do have one other question here about remote solar monitoring of PV production. I think you touched on it earlier, but just to make sure that there's nothing further you want to go on.
Yeah, the biggest issue with remote monitoring is the network, right? So you got to have a network that goes into the remote area. So I'm working on that. Actually, I'm going to hopefully produce some material. Might be web-based or might be a fact sheet. But that is a core thing. You have to have a network connection, or else you can't monitor. So to my surprise, there are a lot of things you can do. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to find some great stuff for you. In the meantime, if you want to contact me, I'll put you in contact with Fish and Wildlife, who's actually successfully done remote site monitoring. That's how I found out about some of these opportunities. So please contact me on that one.
Okay, all right. And Gerald, I also wanted to give you a chance. Some of the questions bear on this, but do you want to talk about some of the work that's coming up that you're engaged on? And maybe, I think you briefly tangentially touched on some of the bolts and fasteners work. Is there anything else that folks might watch for in the future?
Sure, we're working on severe weather topics. We have coming out a new set of basic tech specs. We have a set of tech specs for those that want to put new systems in areas that have severe weather. So, that would be the Southeast or Caribbean or Hawaii. What other things? We're collaborating with the General Services Administration. Hopefully we'll have some new contracting resources out at some point. Got a lot of activities coming. So a lot of resources in the works.
Right. Thank you. I think that covers the questions that we have. I'm going to hand it back to Billie to close us out.
Awesome. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, everyone, for asking those questions. One of the last things we want to do is find out more about what we can do in the future to help with your solar O&M practices. So you should see a poll pop up on your screen now asking what kinds of solar O&M resources would be the most helpful to your organization. This is really for us to be informed on what our next step should be. While everyone's answering this poll, I'll also just do some final thank yous. So I do want to give a huge shout out to all of the participants who helped us gather information for this webinar. We would not have been able to do this without you. And if you're interested in learning more about what our team does, please visit our website at so.lbl.gov/renewables-acquisition. That is everything we have for you today. I'll end this poll now, and it does look like a lot of you want more about PV O&M contracting templates and master agreements. So it's really exciting to know, and something that we'll look forward on working on in the future. So that does bring us to the end of the webinar. We encourage all participants to reach out to us with any questions or comments that you may have moving forward. And thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of the day.